Hello, I know I'm supposed to be reading from these books every night, but man, I'm telling you, it just gets jammed up. There's so much to do. So many books I'm working on. I'm trying to finish my book Rage, and I'm working on a book Music Moves Me, and I'm working on a book Vision, and I still got my fiction to work on that I've been neglecting. So busy, 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 but trying to get to everything, trying to fit everything in. The second founding by Eric Foner. It was just renewed again, so we'll see how many. I think I got it for 3 more weeks, and we'll read as much as we can. And I'm reading on this channel too, No Right to an Honest Living. So I'm reading 2 books, trying to give you as much as I can. A few opponents of the amendment charged that the abolition of involuntary servitude threw into question the legality of a husband's common law right to sexual relations with his wife and to her unpaid labor in the household. Yet most Republicans saw abolition not as reorienting traditional family relations, but as restoring to blacks the natural right to family life so grievously undermined by slavery. In these free families, men would take their rightful place as heads of household and women theirs in the domestic sphere from which slavery had unnaturally removed them. I don't think that's true, but restoring the freedman's manhood and the woman's right to raise their children without white interference was central to conceptions of emancipation. Within this context, unpaid female labor at home was natural, not oppressive, and certainly not a form of involuntary servitude. A husband has a right of property in the service of his wife, said one Republican member of Congress, which the abolition of slavery was not intended to destroy. Along with the right to personal liberty, declared another the right of a husband to his wife, and of a father to his child, comprised the 3 great fundamental natural rights of human society. The amendment was intended to restore these rights, not undermine them. One form of involuntary labor was explicitly authorized by the 13th Amendment. Like the Northwest Ordinance, the amendment allowed involuntary servitude and, perhaps depending on how one read the first section, slavery itself, to continue for those convicted of crime. The criminal exemption, almost unmentioned in the debates of 1864 and 1865, would later take on baleful significance as a constitutional justification for the exploitation of the labor of convicts. We're still dealing with that today, 2025, by the way. The provision referring to those guilty of crime in an excellent illustration of the aphorism that historians write with one eye at least fixed on the present. For decades, scholars of the 13th Amendment paid absolutely no attention to this clause. But with mass incarceration and the widespread use of prison labor suddenly having become national issues, the provision has attracted considerable discussion. They must have been bad historians, because as soon as they did that amendment, almost everything black people did became a crime. So I don't really understand why it's just now becoming an issue for historians. But the Hollywood documentary 13th, for example, draws a straight line from the 13th Amendment to the exploitation for profit of prisons today. To be sure, setting prisoners to work long predated the Civil War and Reconstruction. A large number of convicts, 30,000 or more, had been transported from the British Isles to the colonies in the decades before the American Revolution, and upon arrival sold to labor for a number of years as punishment for crime. After losing its American colonies, Britain found another destination for convicts, Australia, which received 150,000 between the American Revolution and the Civil War. forced hard productive labor, partly to help meet the expense of maintaining prisons, was associated with incarceration. However, despite the proliferation of penitentiaries beginning early in the 19th century, the number of those confined within them remained very small. The prisoner exemption in the 13th Amendment originated in Thomas Jefferson's proposed land ordinance of 1784, which would have barred slavery in all the new nation's territories. From there, it migrated to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which limited the prohibition of slavery to territories north of the Ohio River. Scholars have not explained precisely why Jefferson chose to include this language. The four states, Vermont, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, that enacted constitutions of law abolishing slavery before Jefferson composed the land ordinance, made no mention of involuntary labor as a punishment for crime, although Vermont allowed it for debtors. Jefferson may have feared, as he explained in Notes on the State of Virginia, maybe that's one book I have to get to and read to you all, that freed slaves would become idle and resort to unlawful behavior for which the prospect of prison labor might act as a deterrent. Also, as a devotee of Enlightenment prison reform, Jefferson felt that labor was good for the character. Forced labor would help to rehabilitate criminals and offer an alternative to less humane punishments, such as branding, long-term solitary confinement, and execution. By the time the 13th Amendment was ratified, the coupling of a ban on slavery with a criminal exemption had become so common, so almost to qualify as boilerplate language. It could be found in the Wilmot Provision, which sought to bar slavery from the territories acquired during the Mexican-American War. The Congressional Law of 1862 abolishing slavery in all the territories and in nearly all the constitutions of free states that entered the Union, from Ohio in 1803 to Nevada, the last state admitted before the amendment's ratification. Thaddeus Stevens, probably the most radical member of the House of Representatives, included the same provision in his own draft of an abolition amendment. The 13th Amendment clothed a radical departure in the nation's history in what a Boston newspaper called the well-settled language of a great historical document. But because of its very familiarity, the wording did not undergo necessary scrutiny. The prisoner exemption was almost never discussed in the press or at anti-slavery meetings and black conventions that urged ratification. Only a handful of critics sensed that it might cause problems. The language, the abolitionist journal, the Principia, charged as early as February 1864, changed the Constitution for the worse by appearing to acknowledge that slavery was allowable for adequate cause. Charles Sumner insisted that while the Northwest Ordinance performed an excellent work in its day, its wording was entirely inapplicable to our time, since it implied that men can be enslaved as a punishment for crime. Sumner later wrote that he had hoped to propose eliminating the clause regarding convicted criminals, but failed to act because his colleagues were anxious to get their dinner. I regret now my forbearance, he added. The exemption did not go unnoticed among white Southerners. In November 1865, former Confederate General John T. Morgan pointed out in a speech in Georgia that the 13th Amendment did not prevent states from enacting laws that enabled judicial authorities to consign to bondage blacks convicted of crime. The Southern governments established under Andrew Johnson's Reconstruction Program proceeded to enact a series of laws called the Black Codes. to define and circumscribe the freedom that African Americans now enjoyed, and to make it clear, as Robert M. Patton, the new governor of Alabama, put it, that politically and socially, ours is a white man's government. The Black Code of Mississippi, quickly followed by those of other states, gave blacks certain rights, such as having their marriages recognized in law, but also imposed all sorts of disabilities, including limiting their freedom of movement and barring them from following certain occupations, owning firearms, serving on juries, testifying in cases involving whites, or voting. So I'll read tomorrow, and I'll force myself, even if it's late like now, to read, because we have to read as much as these books as we can. We have to keep some kind of archive as we can. As you know, every other video is behind the paywall. Half of them you get free, half of them, the other half you have to pay for. Use this information in your life. It's very important that we start using information. It's not just something to have or to use over somebody else. Let's start using this stuff. Okay. That's the only option you have other than death. You're going to either use this in your life or be overwhelmed by reality and you'll be gone. Strokes are happening, heart attacks are happening because people are having to face reality. I've always been in reality, so it's not so bad for me. But people I know or know of are struggling. So until next time, until tomorrow, be safe and use the information. And be safe, and be safe, and be safe. Savage lands out here, so be safe.